It's Levi Brackman here with Truth's Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining. This is our Torah Portion Uncensored series of the podcast. And today we are talking about Parashat Bechukotai, which is the final parashah, the final Torah portion in Leviticus, in Vayikra. And it is a fascinating, even perhaps disturbing Torah portion. And we want to get right into it. But before I do, if you like this podcast, please like it, leave a review, etc. wherever you listen to the podcast. That helps other people also find it. So now let's jump into the Torah portion at hand, Bechukotai. So it starts off with Im Bechukotai telechu v'mitzvosai tishmoru v'asisim. If you follow my laws and if you keep my commandments and you do them and you fulfill them, then all these good things will happen to you. And let's read some of those good things, the rewards for following in God's ways and following and keeping his commandments. What will happen? God says, which means I'll provide you with rain at the right time, and the land will bear its crops, and the trees of the field will provide fruit. And it goes on from there. And it says, "V'hisig lochem daish es botzer uvotzer yasik es zora v'achaltem lachem lasoiva v'shavtem v'avetach ba'artzchem v'nasati shalem ba'aretz v'shchavtem v'in machrid v'shpati chayrom in aretz v'cherev loisaver ba'artzchem." And that means that your threshing season will last until your grape harvest, and your grape harvest will last until the time you plant. You will have your fill of food and live securely in the land, and I will grant peace in the land so that you will sleep without fear. I will rid the land of dangerous animals, and the sword will not pass through your land, etc., etc. So, if you follow God's commandments, all these good things happen, and you will have security in your land, you'll have produce, you'll have food, etc., etc. Now, it's interesting because you've got exactly 13 verses which talk about all the good things that will take place if you follow God's commandments. And then afterwards, it straight away flips the script and it says, but if you do not listen to me and you do not keep all these commandments, then all the following will happen to you. And it goes through all the negative things that will take place. And that goes on for multiple verses. Actually, it goes on all the way through till the end of verse 45. So we have approximately 32 verses where God goes on to say all the negative things that will occur, all the punishments that happen for not following God's commandments, versus the 13 for what will happen if you do follow God's commandments. So many more descriptions of the negative consequences for not following God's commandments. Let's read some of them. We'll have the choicest of them, which we will read so that we get a good flavor. Verse 26 says the following with regard to the negative consequences for not fulfilling God's commandments and not listening or hearkening to his words. Here we go. B'shivri lachem mati lechem v'ofu esen noshim lachmechem b'sanur echad v'yishivu lachmechem b'mishkol v'achaltem v'loi sisba'o. And I will cut off your food supply so that 10 women will be able to bake bread in one oven, bringing back only a small amount of bread. You will eat, but you will not be satisfied. And then it goes on, verse 27. V'im b'zois lo sishim oli v'halachtem imi bekeri. And if you still do not obey me and remain indifferent to me, v'alachti imochem b'chamas keri v'yasati eschem afani sheva achatosechem v'chaltem b'sar b'neichem u'v'sar b'nesechem toichelu. And what will happen if you don't? Then I will be indifferent to you with a vengeance, bringing yet another sevenfold increase in the punishment for your sins. You will eat the flesh of your sons and make a meal of the flesh of your daughters, etc., etc. So you get the idea of what goes on here. So if you do not listen to my commandments, terrible things will befall you. you won't have enough food. And not only will you not have enough food, but you will end up feeling the need to eat the flesh of your own children in order to be able to satiate yourself. This is terrible, it seems. What kind of God would want to bring this type of punishment upon his people? And is this really a way in which you are going to encourage people to listen to you and hearken your commandments? And anyway, one might ask, why does God need to revert to such drastic measures in order to be able to encourage people to listen to him? On top of that, we have the original question, which was, one moment here, why couldn't God go on and on about the rewards like he goes on and on about the punishments? And we're about to start the book of Numbers, Sefer Bamidbar. And if you read Bamidbar, there's a lot of killing which goes on in the desert. A lot of wiping out that takes place where God's wrath is kindled against the Israelites and thousands of people end up dying. So this isn't just in theory if you don't listen to me, but this is actually in practice if you don't listen to me. And we got a flavor of that earlier on when the Israelites served the golden calf, where God's wrath is kindled and he kills many people. This theme continues in the book of Numbers, as we shall see. But this isn't just in theory. If you disobey God, there is punishment, swift and severe. That's what it seems, which is why people say that the God of the Old Testament, as the Christians call it, or the God of the Hebrew Bible, the God of the Chumash, is a God which is wrathful and vengeful, and a God that is bloodthirsty in some ways, and takes revenge and punishes those that don't listen to him in a very brutal manner. What kind of God is this, some people might ask? How does this fit in with the Almighty and all-loving God and the God of justice and loving kindness that is portrayed to us in many ways in philosophy and also in religion? So how do we reconcile, in a sense, this God of the Bible with the God that we yearn for, the God of loving kindness, the God of understanding, the God of compassion, the God of mercy? For many people, this is a deal breaker. If you read any of the new atheists, Hitchens and Dawkins and others, you find that this is really a deal breaker for them. A God which is so vengeful. This is a mean-spirited God. This is a God which is jealous. This is a God, in their view, which is full of human frailties, what we would consider to be human frailties. Now, I'm not an apologist for any of this. And so therefore, I understand and I hear the arguments that are made against this type of text made by the new atheists and others in order to cast doubt on the divinity, let's say, of the God as it is presented to us through these texts. But I think it's really instructive to think about what the alternative God is. The God of other religions and the God even of Judaism as it is presented in later epochs, in later eras. What's really conspicuously missing from this text is any kind of punishment that is meted out in a future world. If it's interesting that the reward and punishment are very physical rewards and punishments. It's like, if you do listen to my voice and you do what I command you, then what kind of rewards are you going to get? Well, you're going to have plenty. You're going to have lots of food to eat. You're going to be able to serve God properly, and you're going to have security in your land. Life is going to be good. The life that you live in this world is going to be a good life. What is going to happen if you don't listen to my commandments? Well, life can get really, really hard. Really, really hard. Actually, incredibly hard. 7-fold harder than you think is really difficult. 7 times more difficult than it was before it can get. To the degree where you're so starving that you feel that the only food that you can eat is the flesh of your own children. That's how bad it can get. But one would point out, this is all hard life. Life can be hard. This is a difficult life. If you look at, for example, Christianity, or you look at Islam, you find that there's a God which has a afterlife, which is either tremendously amazing, or you can be condemned to eternal hell and damnation. In other words, there's the God of the Hebrew Bible, which talks about punishments in the here and now, but at least that's not forever. One lives 80, 90, 100, 110, 120 years maximum. And then after that, it's over. All suffering ends. Whereas the God which shows up in later epochs, in later eras, in religions which are post-Judaism, in Christianity and Islam, you find a God which actually takes people in the afterlife and condemns them to eternal suffering. And there are descriptions of what hell is: a fiery hell, demons, suffering, torture that takes place in hell. Not just for a lifetime, but for forever. It's eternal hell and damnation for the sinner. As a matter of fact, if you study Islam, you find that the whole idea of living in this world is really to attain the world to come. It's to attain the next world, which is why you find in Islam, people they're not only are they not afraid to die, but they want to die in many ways, and the way they die matters, because if they die as a martyr, then they go straight into heaven. And going into paradise for them is the best thing that could ever happen. Because the whole idea of living this world is in order to reach paradise. Now, there are elements of that in Judaism, especially in rabbinic writing. But there's no element of it in the Chumash, in the Hebrew Bible. There's no mention in the Chumash, in the 5 books of Moses, of any kind of afterlife whatsoever. As a matter of fact, even the idea of the nefesh, of the neshama, of the soul, when it talks about it, it says, Ki adam hu nefesh, because the blood is the soul. There's a prohibition against drinking blood because the life force is within the blood. And a simple reading of that means that the body cannot operate without blood. And the idea of the Torah is that blood is that thing through which a person can continue to live, because it sustains the person. Without blood, you don't have a life force. So blood represents the very life of the human. It doesn't mean that the blood is the soul. It means that the life force is, in other words, life is sustained through having blood coursing through your veins. But it doesn't actually talk about a soul that will survive posthumously after the person dies. The rewards for doing what God wants is a life in this world, well lived, enjoyed, with a lot of sustenance, with rain at the right time, with success in your life now, with a connection with God dwelling amongst the people. That is the life in this world that you get if you follow God's commandments. If you don't follow God's commandments, then the life lived in this world can get very, very difficult and dark. But there is no mention of any kind of suffering that takes place once one dies. The suffering ends once one dies. There's no idea of a soul which then exists post-life, posthumously, into another life where there is additional reward. That doesn't exist in the Chumash, in the 5 books of Moses, in Torah Moshe. Now, yes, it does exist in the rabbinic law. As a matter of fact, the Talmud talks about what hell can be like and describes actually hell for different people. And there's actually in Ethics of the Fathers, there is talk about this world being a antechamber before the next world, and that one should prepare oneself in this world in order to get to the next world. So there are echoes of this later way of thinking, at least post-Mosaic, let's call it, post-Torah Moshe, post-Mosaic, post-Moses thinking that, yes, there is a next life which the soul goes on into. So there are echoes of that which are found in the works of the rabbis, and there's actually much later books which describe the different types of hell and the different types of punishments that one can get, and the different kinds of sins which bring on different types of punishments, etc. So there are books that talk about this. Where the influence comes from is something which we can discuss and debate, but at least the Mosaic law doesn't have any of that, not even echoes of it. So on the one hand, when you compare these punishments to punishments found in later texts, punishments found in other religions, eternal hell and damnation, eternal suffering of the soul, these punishments seem light compared to them. They seem merciful compared to them. So it all depends what you're comparing it to. If you're comparing this to a good life, yes, these are terribly dark punishments. But if you're comparing it to the hell and damnation of Christianity, of Islam, and of later readings of Judaism, then this is actually very merciful indeed. I would also like to point out, as it relates to rabbinic teachings of hell, that whilst there's a lot of it, it seems like the rabbis are not that comfortable with this idea of hell and that everyone goes to it. So you find the idea of hell tempered quite a bit. I'm going to give two examples, one from the Talmud and one from the Midrash, but they're both related to the same story. So the Talmud says in Eruvin 19a that wicked Jews are sentenced to hell, but Abraham brings them up. So although if you're a wicked Jew, you can go to hell, Abraham brings them up from hell. So you have this idea of, the one hand, wicked people are being sent to hell, they're sentenced to hell, and Abraham goes and takes them out of hell. So in other words, this idea of hell is not something which actually is sustainable, because Abraham is busy taking these people out of hell, except for an example of someone who Abraham does not take out of hell, and that is someone who has sexual relations with a non-Jewish person. Because according to this reading of the Talmud, a Jewish person who has relations with a non-Jewish woman, it's like he is stretching out his foreskin. In other words, by having sexual relations with a non-Jewish woman, it's like he is bringing himself back into the category of being uncircumcised, and therefore his relationship with Abraham, who Abraham was the first Jew who circumcised himself, is no longer there, and therefore Abraham is not helping to take him out of hell. Similarly, in Bereshis Rabbah, in the Midrash Bereshis Rabbah 45:8, it says, Rabbi Levi says that in the future, Abraham will sit at the entrance to hell and will not allow anyone who is circumcised to go into hell. So anyone who's sent to hell, if they're circumcised, then they do not go into hell. So Abraham, being the great protector of the Jewish people from going to hell, that exists in the Talmud. But if you think about the subtext to it, we have a concept of hell. That idea of hell made its way into Jewish texts. But it seems to me, at least my reading of these rabbinic commentaries on hell and Abraham's role in it, is that, you know what, maybe there is a hell, but it doesn't really relate to the vast majority of people. The vast majority of people never experience that hell. The vast majority of people, even if they sin, even if they're very wicked, they never get into hell. And Abraham is the person who protects them. He takes them out from that. Why? Because we have this bris, we have this circumcision. And what is a circumcision? Circumcision is the covenant with God, and that covenant with God lasts even posthumously. And because that covenant exists, and Abraham is the one who represents that covenant, therefore he takes them out of hell and makes sure they don't go into hell. Interestingly, in the Torah portion of Bechukotai, which we just read, there is actually a part of this which talks about the covenant, and it says as follows in verse 45. V'zacharti lehem bris rishonim asher tzesi yosemer mitzrayim linagim liyosehem leElohim ani Hashem. I will therefore remember the covenant of their original ancestors, whom I brought out of Egypt in the sight of the nations, so as to be a God to them. I am God. So at the end, it talks about this covenant. So God remembers the covenant. And when does that happen? So the word here is Oz Yikona Lavav Ma'orel, Oz Yirtza Savonam, which means, and then their uncircumcised heart will be subdued. Ha'orel, you can translate it as uncircumcised heart. The uncircumcised heart will become subdued. And then what happens then? And then I will remember the covenant which was made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the idea of bris, the idea of circumcision, is related in this Torah portion to the idea of circumcision, in this case circumcision of the heart or uncircumcised heart. But that is related to the idea of the covenant, and the idea of the covenant is related to God remembering the covenant, and at that time the punishment stops. So the idea here is that even in hell, if you're circumcised and you therefore have a sign of the covenant, then you don't get punished. So the idea of hell is very much tempered in Rabbinic Judaism. Although there is a hell, that hell is not really relevant if most people never get into that hell. And most Jews are circumcised, and there's always you might ask, what about women who don't have circumcision? Well, that's a separate conversation. But the idea here is that hell is not that relevant because although it exists, most people don't experience it, and therefore it's not that relevant. So when you look overall at the idea of Judaism as it relates to reward and punishment, one might say two things. First of all, the punishment is in the here and now. It's not in an afterlife. And to the extent that Judaism does have punishment in an afterlife, the rabbis kind of more or less say that's not relevant to most people, even to the sinners. For most people, that's not relevant. And even if God wanted to punish them in hell, in an afterlife, because they were sentenced to hell, doesn't matter. You have this idea of the covenant, and Abraham, who is the God of the covenant, makes sure that people don't go to hell. So a religion which has a punishment in the here and now and not in the afterlife, I think feels much more comfortable than a religion that has a hell in the afterlife. And the idea of living your life in this world is to live a life in security, in your land, in this world, in the here and now, where God dwells amongst you. That is heaven on earth indeed, rather than living a life for some kind of posthumous heaven or some kind of posthumous hell which might happen, or making sure not to sin because you're scared to go to hell. That to me doesn't feel like a religion or a ideology that is attractive at all. So the idea that you're living a life and that there are consequences to one's actions, whether good or bad, if you behave in a positive way, in a responsible way, you're going to live a good life. And if you behave in a negative way and you don't follow some of these rules, you don't have proper boundaries in your life, that's really what it is, then you're going to suffer. And specifically, if as a society you don't live a life with these boundaries, then the society as a whole will suffer. That rings true to me. That rings true as something that actually occurs in the world, if not exactly as it's written in this book, in the Torah. It still rings true that if you live a life with boundaries and you live a life disciplined and you follow certain rules, you might call it universal rules and laws of life, in a disciplined way, you're much more likely to have a good life, both for you and for the society in which you live, rather than if someone contravenes those rules, contravenes those ideas, then we suffer and things can become difficult. That rings true, and that seems to me to be the idea which is presented here in these verses. And you might argue that this is more of a primitive way of presenting these ideas, but whichever way it is, these ideas do ring true to me at least, and I think this is what the text is really trying to convey. So this concludes the book of Leviticus. We will go on to the book of Numbers. I will share that I was thinking of discontinuing Torah Portion Uncensored as part of the podcast, but I felt and do feel that these are really valuable, at least for me, because I get to study them in greater depth because I'm doing this. There are some other people who really seem to enjoy them as well, and that's the feedback I get. And therefore, I will continue doing this into the book of Numbers, and I will continue to do my commitment to complete the entire 5 books of Moses for this podcast. Thank you so much for joining. This has been Levi Brackman with Truth's Jewish Wisdom for Today with our Torah Portion Uncensored series. And until next time.